I remember the stillness best. It's always a manufactured stillness, the kind you only get when the world agrees to stop simultaneously. Christmas morning, 3 minutes before the caffeine kicks in and the wrapping paper massacre begins. You stand in the semi-darkness, the scent of pine and something metallic, maybe, thick in the air. We are taught, implicitly and explicitly, that this is the moment of peak payoff, the apex of the year's emotional investment. Yet, if you listen closely, not to the carols or the chimes, but to the rhythm inside your own chest, it rarely sounds like pure joy. It sounds like release, like the sudden cessation of a temporal pressure cooker. It sounds terrifyingly like a deadline finally met. We approach the 25th of December not with simple anticipation, but with the grim necessity of a project manager facing a critical year-end deliverable. We rush the shopping, we rush the parties, we rush the perfection of the meal. Why does the season of good will feel so intensely mandatory? The pressure is just commercial. It feels ancient. It feels dictated. We talk about the spirit of Christmas, but what if the true tradition we are adhering to isn't spiritual at all, but purely administrative? What if the frantic joy is just a reaction to having successfully fulfilled a forgotten, binding obligation? I've spent years looking at calendars, not just marking dates, but trying to understand why they force our hand. When I started pulling the threads on the hidden histories of midwinter celebrations, the Roman Saturnalia, the Germanic Yule, the Byzantine time, reckoning shifts. I wasn't looking for dark rituals. I was looking for the instruction manual. I wanted to find the forgotten civic code, the administrative footnote that turned the most cheerful day of the year into the most rigid, and I found it. It's a mechanism buried deep inside the structure of how Western society handles debt, duty, and the crushing expectation of renewal. It's a historical trigger that ensures you cannot simply enjoy Christmas. You must complete it. The cognitive dissonance is palpable. We spend months preparing for a single day that is meant to represent endless peace, yet every cultural marker, from department store signage to the aggressive timing of our family commitments, screams, hurry. This anxiety is the residue of centuries of seasonal reckoning. Everything we associate with Christmas, the gift, giving, the feasting, the enforced cheer, falls outside our normal budgeting, both financial and emotional. This wasn't always just about celebrating a holiday. For millennia, the dead of winter was the ultimate accounting period. In earlier epochs across the UK and the nascent US states, the settling of major debts, the renewal of tenant leases, the hiring of annual staff, and the redistribution of essential resources often clustered around the winter solstice or the 12 days immediately following. It was a societal purge. If you owed something, time, money, or favor, the long, dark nights provided the final, inescapable moment of reckoning before the new agricultural and fiscal cycle began. The promise of the new year was conditional on the successful termination of the old one. This created a profound collective anxiety, a silent scream in the archives that echoes down to us. You must finish this now, or the future is penalized. We think we've shed those agrarian or feudal deadlines, replacing them with commercial jingles and fairy lights strung across suburban eaves. But the historical momentum remains. We inherited the structure, even after forgetting the context. The desperate need for that one day to feel right is merely a modernized echo of that long, forgotten civic duty. It's the subconscious dread that if the emotional or financial books aren't balanced by the 25th, the new year will begin with an immediate unseen penalty. We are, psychologically, still standing before the unseen master demanding final accounts before the snow thaws, desperate to prove our worthiness for the next year. Grace. I will show you precisely which forgotten dates and traditions, stemming not from religious doctrine, but from cold, hard historical accounting, still force the panic deep inside the festive cheer. I will show you why the sheer act of sitting down to a family dinner on the 25th of December feels less like a choice and more like the fulfillment of an ancient, binding contract. And once you see the mechanism of control hidden beneath the tinsel, you can unsee it. If Christmas is truly defined by forced completion, what exactly is the cost of failing to meet the emotional deadline? And what happens to the people who realize they simply cannot afford to pay the bill? We accept the 25th of December as a fixed point, an inevitable cosmic anchor. We see the date on the calendar, and we feel the gravitational pull of expectation immediately tighten. But the date itself, the specific 24 hours, was once highly fluid, the center of gravity perpetually shifting. For centuries, the celebration of Christmas was not confined to a single morning burst. It was an unfolding 12-day period of revelry and release, stretching from the Nativity through to Epiphany on the 6th of January. The pressure was distributed, diffused across nearly 2 weeks of feasting and mild anarchy. This diffusion was exactly what made the early celebration suspect to those who sought rigid societal control. The darkness beneath the tinsel began not with malice, but with puritanical anxiety. If we look back to 17th century England and colonial America, we find an era that didn't just dislike Christmas, it outlawed it entirely. The Commonwealth Parliament declared it illegal in 1647. Why? Because the prolonged holiday fostered chaos. It was too much unsupervised joy, too much drink, too much freedom for the lower classes. It was a failure of productivity and a threat to order. They did not just ban the frivolity. They enforced the opening of shops and the strict continuation of labor on the 25th of December. They attempted to erase the entire festival from the calendar. It is one of history's most profound ironies. By violently resisting the celebration, they fixed the date permanently in the public imagination as a point of contention and significance. They forced the idea of the 25th of December underground, turning it into a defiant act when Christmas was eventually resurrected in the 19th century. A time of intense social anxiety driven by urbanization and the rapid erosion of community. It needed a new purpose. It was cleaned up, sanitized, and fundamentally repurposed from a collective, often rowdy release into a localized domestic moral performance. This is the hinge upon which the deadline was built. The Victorians, masters of moral economy, decided Christmas should be primarily about children and selfless giving. But the crucial element they introduced was precision timing. Historically, gifts were traditionally exchanged on New Year, Seste, or sometimes Twelfth Night. Why the abrupt shift to the precise morning of the 25th of December? It wasn't religious doctrine. It was purely logistical. The rising industrial and postal systems needed a single, massive, immovable date to coordinate the deluge of goods. They manufactured the deadline because the emerging retail economy required a unified moment of high demand. If gifts arrived on different dates, the entire supply chain faltered. The sudden, intense focus on a 4-hour window of required perfect delivery was, essentially, a commercial invention designed for operational efficiency. The sheer ambition of this shift is what binds us today. The expectation is not merely that gifts exist, but that they are wrapped, placed, and ready in a theatrical, organized fashion 4-4. The intended recipient wakes. It is the ritual performance of having conquered time itself. It speaks to a deep, unspoken need to prove our worth through the invisible, strenuous labor of preparation. The deadline demands proof that we sacrificed our time, our energy, and our resources perfectly in the dark hours. This domestic performance was further escalated by the architectural change in gift presentation. Consider the quiet tradition of the Christmas stocking. A small, intimate vessel for useful, often edible, gifts, an orange, a few sweets, a small, practical toy. Then came the imported spectacle of the German Christmas tree, popularized in the UK by Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. The tree demanded scale. It demanded bulk. It became the stage upon which wealth and generosity were publicly displayed, moving the act of giving from a private gesture of affection to a massive, performative economic transaction. The stocking, a tradition that emphasized need and intimacy, was relegated to a side hustle, overshadowed by the shimmering, towering expectation beneath the pine needles. The size of the expected offering grew exponentially. And with it, the pressure on the provider. The moment the child touches the first present is the moment the provider is judged. The deadline is ends. About the calendar date. It's about the exact microsecond. The light hits the wrapping paper. Think about the structure of that morning, which is still gospel in millions of us in UK homes. The 4 a.m. wake up call for the parent. The stealth required to place, assemble, or finish the final wrapping. The self-imposed mandate that says, if the child wakes up and the scene is not perfect, the magic has failed. And therefore, you have failed. The tradition demands that this immense logistical feat must look effortless, as if Santa's elves, or perhaps Santa himself, conducted the operation in blissful silence. What are we truly meeting the deadline for? It has long ceased to be about celebrating a spiritual birth. It has become about affirming our transactional identity within the family unit. The Christmas morning deadline is the annual inspection of our emotional and economic solvency. We are judged on preparation, on presentation, on quantity, and on perceived success of the surprise. I look at the historical records, and I see the blueprints of modern anxiety drawn out over 150 years ago. They engineered a moment of mandatory, simultaneous fulfillment. And in doing so, they embedded the anxiety of the ticking clock into the very heart of the holiday. The result is the strange contradictory feeling that permeates the 25th of December. Immense joy mingled with the profound, lingering exhaustion of having just survived a major operational audit. The true darkness isn't tea in a buried pagan rite or a forgotten murder. It's in the cold, calculated efficiency of turning selfless love into a high-stakes, time-sensitive delivery contract. We've traced the deeper wiring of the winter feast, the necessity of the light, the ancient bargaining with the dark. But the deadline that haunts us now, the one that forces us into crowded aisles in late December, is not an ancient mechanism. It is a modern innovation, a piece of social engineering that took root precisely when the calendar shifted from spiritual marker to economic engine. I wanted to know when the pressure became not just cultural, but statistical. When did the failure to deliver the perfect Christmas shift from a personal disappointment to a documented societal crisis? The answer, like so many truths, is buried in the archives of urban newspapers and police reports from the turn of the 20th century, a time when newly available installment plans and rampant advertising had begun to fuse personal identity irrevocably with consumer output. The Christmas deadline became concrete, enforced not by winter winds, but by the bailiff. Before 1900, the holidays certainly had their stresses, but the weight was distributed unevenly. After 1905, particularly in the booming US cities and the mercantile heartlands of the UK, the weight concentrated into an unbearable singularity. Christmas Eve. There is a forgotten headline, one that echoes through countless small regional papers between 1910 and 1930. They didn't call it depression or anxiety then. They called it the Christmas collapse. This was the annual spike in acute financial despair, sudden flight, and the tragic public shaming of those who simply could not meet the demands of the season. The forgotten event isn't a single riot or political scandal. It is the systemic, predictable implosion of the failed participant. Think about the sheer emotional weight placed upon the male breadwinner in the early 20th century. His entire social contract rested on his capacity to provide. The new industrial economy provided goods, but the newly industrialized advertising engine defined success. That engine told him, unequivocally, that his love, his worth, and his moral standing were quantified by the pile of shiny commercially packaged goods beneath the tree on Christmas morning. This wasn't just about disappointing a child. It was about disgracing the family name. The deadline wasn't the last day to shop. It was the final moment to prove your solvency, your suitability, your very right to exist within the respectable middle class. What percentage of the dread you feel today when the credit card statement arrives in January is simply the residual terror of those generations who knew failure could mean destitution or public scorn. I spent time sifting through municipal records from boroughs like Hackney in London and the Lower East Side of New York, the records of the working poor who were the first testing ground for mass consumer credit. What you find is a pattern. The vast majority of personal debt crises that culminated in immediate, visible police intervention, eviction, sudden abandonment, or worse, clustered around the last week of December and the first week of January. Predictable pressure valve designed to separate the solvent from the disposable. The pressure of the deadline was reinforced by a narrative weaponized by newspapers and department stores alike, the unhappy Christmas. Was a moral stain if you failed to provide the prescribed happiness. You were judged by your community as lazy, feckless, or morally bankrupt. It was a failure of character, not commerce. This subtle, pervasive shaming is the forgotten mechanism that enforces our modern need for perfection. We internalize the deadline because we have been taught, generationally, that missing it signifies a deep personal failing. And this is where the historical data becomes genuinely chilling. Because the pressure valve was purely financial, it was existential. In the archives of the Ford British Medical Journal and early American psychological texts, there are references to the mid-winter seasonal exacerbation of melancholia, a clinical way of documenting the fact that Christmas Day, far from being a universal peak of joy, was often the statistical high point for certain forms of emotional and domestic collapse. The silence of Christmas morning in the homes of the failed. That perfect, still moment just before the family descends became a flashpoint for internal crisis. There is one particularly harrowing report from a Cincinnati police log, 1922. It detailed a series of incidents tied directly to Christmas Eve, specifically citing individuals who confessed they could not face the morning. The tragedy was that society had created a scenario where simply existing beyond the point of perceived failure was deemed too costly. The deadline had been missed, the proof of worth had not been provided, and the logical consequence, in their desperate minds, was erasure. This detail, this predictable annual surge in human despair, tied to a forced moment of peak happiness, is the true hidden tradition of modern Christmas. It's the hidden tax we pay for the spectacle. The feeling of being overwhelmed by the commercial holiday isn't merely consumer fatigue. It is an echo of the historical terror of the Christmas collapse. We feel the deadline approaching not because we are naturally poor planners, but because historically, missing that deadline meant public failure and the brutal withdrawal of societal approval. We look at the twinkling lights and the perfect advertisements and feel the familiar, sickening lurch in our gut. That feeling is the silent memory of the early 20th century, the memory of a time when the pressure to produce joy became an enforced rule, and failure was met with unforgiving silence. We are still running from that census of despair, trying desperately to prove that we are worthy of the perfect tableau, desperately trying to prove that we are not among the forgotten ghosts of the annual collapse. What exactly was society trying to cover up by forcing this relentless joy, this impossible deadline? What was the deeper truth that the perfect tinsel, draped image was designed to suppress? We have traced the wires of commerce and the dense lobbying of Victorian industrialists who saw the potential in centering a market around a single morning. We have acknowledged the very real deadlines imposed by shipping routes and department store inventory. But these are merely the scaffolding. The deeper truth, the hidden wiring that makes Christmas morning feel less like a joyful celebration and more like the end of a very long, high-stakes fiscal quarter, is rooted not in economics, but in chronology. It is the architectural shift of the holy timeline itself. I began to look not at fondue what we were celebrating, but fondue we were required to respond to it. For centuries, across much of Europe, the peak moment of gift exchange was not the 25th of December. That day was solemn, religious. The secular release, the great celebration of human generosity, and the actual exchange of gifts was reserved for the 6th of January, Epiphany, the Feast of the Magi, Three Kings Day. Think about that subtle but seismic difference. The Magi brought their gifts after a long journey. Their action was a response, a studied post-event commemoration of the arrival they had sought. The Christmas season, historically, was a period of 12 days, a window of time, a period of grace between the spiritual event, the birth, and the material acknowledgement. The gifts, when the tradition held Epiphany as the center, we, the recipients and the givers, had time to process, to reflect, to earn the celebratory moment. The deadline was far away, allowing for slow, true joy to percolate. But the 19th century cultural engineers, driven by both commercial opportunity and a desire to consolidate spiritual energy, moved the great material moment from the 6th of January back to the morning of the 25th of December. This single shift fundamentally rewrote the psychological contract of the holiday, converting it instantly from a 12-day celebration of culmination into a sharp, instant pressure point. We no longer celebrate a journey that has concluded. We are positioned directly at the moment of the event, forcing an immediate reaction. We are not watching the story unfold and bringing our thoughtful response 2 weeks later. We are expected to receive the blessing, unpack the consequence, and deliver the correct emotional feedback, all before the first cup of coffee. This is the twist. Christmas morning is a deadline, because it is now, inescapably, a moment of immediate inspection. If the gifts represent blessings, whether they be divine favor or Santa's approval, then the moment we receive them becomes the moment we must justify the expenditure. The anxiety surrounding the holiday, the frantic search for the perfect object, the stressed wrapping, the precise staging of the tree, is preparation for this moment of judgment. The deadline isn't about meeting retail hours. It is about meeting the expectation of worthiness. I realized the feeling of being rushed wasn't about time management. It was about performance management. When you receive a great reward, you are instantly indebted. The deadline we feel looming on the morning of the 25th is the deadline for immediate, visible, and overwhelming gratitude. You must be delighted. You must be surprised. You must be grateful enough to validate the months of work and thousands of dollars spent. You must perform the role of the joyous recipient flawlessly, or the entire apparatus collapses. This is the critical difference between Epiphany giving and Christmas morning giving. Epiphany was an echo of generosity. Christmas morning is a demand for immediate psychological payment. When you rush your child to the tree at 6 a.m., you are rushing them not to experience wonder, but to meet the deadline of emotional proof. Were they good enough? Was I, the parent, generous enough? Is this display proof that the last year, messy and flawed as it was, culminated in moral and financial success? We use the phrase, "The holiday isn't about the gifts," but culturally, the structure insists that it is precisely about the immediate, high-pressure exchange of material proof. The US-UK tradition demands that the entire emotional tenor of the previous 364 days be validated by the contents of the stockings and the display under the tree. This is why, culturally, we have developed specific, almost tyrannical rules for the performance of Christmas morning. The mandatory expressions of awe, even if the socks are disappointing. The absolute necessity of having the moment captured on film, proving to the archive of family history that the deadline was met, the expectation fulfilled. We are terrified of the silence, the small look of confusion, the delayed reaction, because that silence is proof that the pressure point failed. It reveals the transaction for what it is, a tightly scheduled exchange of material goods for emotional validation. The Victorian architects of this new, condensed Christmas understood the power of immediacy. They knew that by moving the reward to the very moment of culmination, they removed the possibility of casual reception. They created a moment so dense with obligation that joy itself became an enforced prerequisite. You feel the deadline on Christmas morning because the timeline has been artificially collapsed. There is no grace period. There is no reflection. You are standing on the starting line and the finish line simultaneously, required to react, receive, and appreciate without hesitation. When you open those gifts, you are not just seeing wood and plastic. You are seeing the materialization of a year's hopes, expectations, and moral ledger, and the clock is ticking for your reaction. This is the hidden deadline that chills the genuine warmth of the day, the demand that we instantaneously prove ourselves worthy of the generosity we receive, turning deep, contemplative celebration into a highly stressful, non-negotiable performance review. The true gift of Christmas was reflection. The hidden trade-off was the imposition of control through immediacy. We weren't given a holiday. We were given an annual audit, disguised as wonder. And every year, that deadline arrives at dawn on the 25th of December, demanding immediate satisfaction. We began by asking why the most joyous morning of the year often feels less like a celebration and more like a deadline. The answer, as it so often is that the feeling itself is the residue of history. The anxiety we feel is simply the modern manifestation of societal pressure, the internalized requirement to prove worth, either through material display or impeccable scheduling, designed to satisfy the ghost of a far stricter, far colder calendar. I've watched the pattern repeat across countless files. When a meaningful, difficult tradition loses its theological justification, it rarely disappears entirely. It just swaps its spiritual teeth for psychological ones. The anxiety shifts from the debt owed to the divine to the debt owed to expectation, our own, our family's, and that of the wider culture that watches and judges the performance of perfect Christmas spirit. This is the great twist hidden beneath the tinsel. The rush, the frantic need for completion before the clock strikes noon, isn't about ensuring Santa made it down the chimney. It is about satisfying that ancient, ingrained fear that if the ritual isn't perfect, if the display isn't immaculate, something essential will be lost. We are trying to outrun a date that stopped being relevant centuries ago, yet the timer continues to tick loudly in the collective subconscious. I'll file this piece under observed rituals. The investigation is concluded. The dates are noted, and the context is clear. But knowing the mechanics rarely stops the machine. Next time you stand in the pale, cold morning light, watching the wrapping paper pile up, feel the pressure. That faint, deep thrum beneath the celebration. Understand that what you're rehearing isn't sleigh bells. It's the quiet, insistent sound of a deadline finally being met. And once you hear it, it becomes almost impossible to unsee. The magic, I suppose, is how well we have learned to love the pressure.